Welcome to Technically, the webinar series devoted to the technical challenges of making the web accessible. This month's presenter is Thomas Logan, founder and CEO of Equal Entry.
All right, everyone. Welcome to the December version of Technically. Michael Beck, the operations manager at Tenon. This month we have Thomas Logan from Equal Entry. We'll be discussing single switch usability, correct?
Yes.
Yes. So take it away, Thomas. It's all you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. All right.
Oh, but before we begin, if anybody could put any questions in the chat, we'll get to them at the end of the presentation.
Great. So I'm going to just get my screen set up here. Make sure this comes through. All right. So as introduced here, my name is Thomas Logan. I've worked in the accessibility space my whole career. So I started as a computer science student at University of North Carolina, and I worked with a student who was blind in the classics department, thinking about accessibility for ancient world maps. And that was, my first exposure to thinking about technology and how technology can provide access to information. And so I've basically spent my whole career always being interested in this topic of what can we do to make, different experiences that prior to technology might have been very difficult. What can we enable via technology? So today's topic of considering single switch accessibility, very appreciative to have this opportunity to talk to you all about this today. I was very interested to get to work on this topic in a small consulting project this year, where basically the task and the request was to consider how to improve a specific experience for someone that uses a single switch. And I appreciated that opportunity as an area to focus on because, I think historically, and as I said, I've been over 15 years working in accessibility. I find that a lot of the work, rightfully so, often focuses, more broadly on standards like the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And my most significant experience is working with screen readers and considering how people who are blind get programmatic access or underlying access to information. So this opportunity to really think deeply about the single switch accessibility use case really gave me that opportunity to explore and understand some of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines better, or through a different lens than I had in the past. And so wanted to have this be, a conversation and demonstration today. Probably a lot of you here have not had projects working on single switch accessibility. Maybe some of you on the webinar today have. So I kind of lead here with, this is my experience working really focused on a project, but I'm always eager to learn from everyone else's experiences. So I wanted to start with this quote and key point when we're thinking about single switches. So the concept is, for some people, their interactions with the world take place through a single switch. Imagine having to control everything you want using a light switch. So I liked that. This is actually from a research paper I'll be showing later in the presentation. But I liked that way to consider this, actually turning on a light switch. It's a binary on or off. It's a single switch that we can use to turn the lights on or off in a room. And this is basically what we need to be considering or thinking about for this technology use case of, we have the ability to control a single switch. How can we get, every interaction that needs to be taken made available through just that single switch? So I think some of the ideas here, some of the ways that people can control switches. We can blink eyes, we could move our head, we could move a hand. Maybe some people would have the dexterity to move, their entire hand, maybe balled up as a fist, or maybe, just only having one finger on a hand, again, considering that someone may be able to move all 5 fingers or 10 fingers, the ability to control a switch, to control a single switch, we could potentially just use a single finger to control that single switch. We could use an elbow, a foot, a toe, a knee, tongue. It's definitely broad spectrum here. And again, what I want to stress of one of the points in today's presentation is I wanted to look from the single switch use case because that was actually the design thinking. But you know, obviously the reality, and one of the things that's interesting about considering use cases for people with motor impairments of the upper or lower extremity is any combination of these abilities could be present, you know, for an individual. So some individuals may be able to control 5 switches, 8 switches. Some individuals may only be able to control 1 switch. So that's just part of the design thinking that I think will also be interesting as we have this discussion. So one of the techniques, and I'll be demonstrating this with the different products. Scanning is the way that on a technology interface, we can have a single switch, be able to access information, and scanning is basically being able to move through a list of items one at a time and then indicate by tapping or switching. So on the screen I have, this is basically going to be the iPad demo. Oops. But on the iOS, we have inside of the accessibility settings, you know, the great thing about Apple's iOS, each new release, getting more and more of these accessibility options and settings. But, you know, one piece of that is we've got to look through this whole list to find the one we're looking for. The switch control is the accessibility control on iOS that you can use to see this functionality. And so inside of these configuration settings, I actually have, excuse me, only set to have a single switch. So this is, again, this idea that, you know, many people may be able to control more than one switch, but if we start from, you know, the baseline, we can start with a single switch, and then we have a lot of different configuration options for that single switch. But the concept is when we turn the single switch on, we now see a red highlight rectangle that starts moving between each interactive item that's on the screen. So it skips over things that are just plain text, but anything that could be clicked on to be controlled has this highlight focus move through the screen. And the number of times, right, that loops through the screen can be controlled. The speed of that loop can also be controlled. So I have this going at 0.5 seconds. It's actually like 500 milliseconds on each element that could be clicked on the screen. And that's actually moving, you know, quite fast. So that's, again, part of understanding the individual use cases is someone may be able to move very quickly with the, you know, the head or the tongue or the part of their body they're using to control the switch. Another user may need more time to actually hit and activate that switch. So that's why all of these different options, and I'm gonna tap off the switch now, hopefully do a good demo of that. Oops. All right, so I've turned off the switch, but I could actually give myself more time for how long to control that switch by changing this auto scanning time to a different value. And that will slow down how quickly that highlight rectangle moves around the interface. But I think one of the interesting points here is I, at least, you know, very frequently, if I'm doing accessibility testing, I typically use VoiceOver, and I have this model, right, of sometimes swiping right and just swiping through every element that's on the screen to make sure that, you know, it has an accessibility alternative and a name, a role, a value, those types of things. But one of the things that's cool with the switch is seeing that rather than having to swipe right, swipe left, and navigate through all the elements on the screen, using the switch access is a good way to actually test the logical ordering of elements on a particular screen that you're looking at. And so that'll be a part I'll really stress when we go into the illustrative example of composing music is the position and the logical ordering that we choose of elements on the screen is one thing I think as people who work in developing or designing software, this is a consideration that could be put more at the forefront for some of the design thinking when we want to consider all users that will need to access our technology. So this is just the other point to say that, you know, when we think about one of the WCAG standards is saying everything has to be accessible from the keyboard, operable from the keyboard. There's over 100 switches on every standard keyboard. So, you know, the dexterity and the ability to individually access all of those keys, you know, with 10 fingers, we've got all these different switches and we can frequently get very complicated interactions when we design for keyboard accessibility. And that's one of the assumptions that, you know, we need to challenge potentially and have more consideration for, I think, especially in software design for the web and for desktop, is that, you know, these complex key sequences like holding Control Option U, or, you know, having, you know, Control Alt Delete is another common memorable one from the Windows days. You know, those combinations and those requirements to control the interface through the keyboard can be much more difficult when you don't have, you know, control of multiple switches to execute those, you know, quickly or easily. So that is another thing that I just wanted to quickly show as a demonstration comparison, is that I'm on the on a Windows PC here, but this is one of the tools built into, it's been built into Windows at least since Windows Vista, maybe earlier. But there's the ability to use a single switch with this virtual keyboard that exists on Windows. And so this is, I think, a good example of this functionality does at least come in by default, that I could basically select any key on the keyboard through the scanning method, similar to how we saw a scanning method on iOS. On Windows, this functionality actually groups keys together into groups of 4, and I can use my spacebar or some other single switch to look for a row of keys, wait till it gets highlighted on the key that I want, and then tap to start typing. And so this keyboard has up at the top some autocomplete functionality to learn, you know, again, typing this way and actually needing to type, complete a form field, say on the web, using just a single switch. The more that this auto prediction can work to guess the words, you know, autocomplete the words that need to be typed in. Again, that's the feature or function that can help someone that needs to do input via this type of mechanism. But I would say that obviously one of the things for me in getting to do this project, I looked at what comes out of the box on Windows, on Mac, on iOS, and Android. And I think, you know, for right now on Windows, a lot of the functionality for more advanced functionalities for switch control would require either purchasing third-party software or obtaining, you know, open source software that can run on Windows that gives some more of the advanced features that you would need for controlling an interface, because built into Windows, we just have this keyboard interface control. I wanted to mention this video. I'm not going to play the video in the stream today, but I do have an article that I'll be showing at in the presentation that has links to everything that I'm demonstrating today. But this is the Apple accessibility video from a few years ago. This is a woman named Sadie who was able to create the video. And if you haven't seen the video, I highly recommend, you know, watching the entire video. But the point of the video was that Sadie is a cinematographer, video editor. And Sadie, in this case, has the ability to control 2 switches with her head. So she's actually using an interface or a configuration on the map where if she moves her head to the left and clicks this switch, she can use one piece of functionality for scanning. And when she moves her head to another side and clicks the switch on the other side of her head, she can use that to actually tap or select the item underneath the functionality. And so in the video itself, one of the examples they're showing is actually doing complex mouse operations using those switches, where basically on the left we have iMovie or Final Cut, some type of video editing software. And we're able to, using those single switches, click and select items and then glide or drag them down into the timeline view to create editing. So this is showing another thing I was showing on the Mac. We have the keyboard emulation, and this is also something we would have on Windows, but this is showing mouse emulation, and that could also be something that needs to be available to the single switch user, is the ability to left click, double click, triple click, gliding, dragging. All of those features could also potentially be exposed through named commands, and basically a list of commands on the screen. I wanted to comment on the game accessibility guidelines. So I've been doing, and I think a lot of people have been paying more attention to game accessibility as of late. And one thing that's interesting about the game accessibility guidelines that's a little different from, say, the web content accessibility guidelines is that there is a good focus, or a larger focus, on considerations for people that need to have remapped controls or be able to use switches or alternative input devices to control games. So one of the off of here. One of the cool things lately, right, is the Xbox Adaptive Controller. So this is actually something that was developed and released this year in 2018. But the Xbox Adaptive Controller is a controller that comes with basically the left, right, up, down analog controls, and it has these two very large buttons similar to what could be purchased as a single switch. There's two single switches on this adaptive controller. And then the control itself has a bunch of other switches that can be connected to the back. So this is showing that you could basically set up a system or set up an interface to control typing in the Y button, the X button, the B button, the A button, all the different buttons that get used. Because different games use different buttons, this piece of hardware sort of shows this idea of flexibility for, like, how can we connect all these different types of switches? And these are examples of what other switches might look like that connect to the device to allow people to control them. So one of the things in the game accessibility guidelines is this requirement to allow controls to be remapped and reconfigured. And so that's something that I think is really important, and that I don't see lots of common design implementations of this in desktop and web software. I think we do have, obviously, lots of software that does do these things, but there's not very general ways for a lot of web functionality or desktop functionality to easily have the controls being remapped and reconfigured. And so this is just a quote, for one example of someone that would benefit from remapped and reconfigured. I was born with cerebral palsy. I can't walk and have very limited use of my hands. I love video games of all shapes and sizes. I've been playing since I was 3 years old. I just wanted to thank you, Blizzard, for having near endless control, customization, and Overwatch. I don't know if this was your goal, but because of your extensive options, I'm able to play every character in the roster, and it feels great. Because of you, I made my first snipe in a video game today. So that's Zach via Reddit. Snipe is a video game term for, I think, shooting someone and getting them with one hit. But that idea here is that one of the features that Overwatch supports is this sort of rich configuration UI where you don't have to say that a particular button performs a certain action in the user interface. And that's something that, again, when we think about a single switch, if you think about a game that has lots of different buttons, we could think about making the single switch, the ordering of the buttons that get cycled through for that switch could be a limited set, really customized to a game. And if we have this full remapping and customization, someone that even uses a single switch, hopefully will be able to get that snipe. All right, so we've got game accessibility guidelines, got this. And so now I'm going to go into basically the key part of today was just to take you through an illustration of some work that I did considering making Songmaker, which is a music composition app from Google Creative Labs. And inside of the video, I'm going to switch to this presentation. This is the link that I'll be sending out to the attendees today, but this has links to all of the demonstrations and resources that are in the presentation today.
Music is for everyone. That's why we started Chrome Music Lab.
So inside of this, the basic premise of how the Songmaker is explained is music making should be for everyone. And in this example, it's showing touch screen where we can tap and input notes into a musical grid and then hit a big play button that then starts playing music on the screen. And they have adapted this and made that work on, iOS, or sorry, on a mobile device screen, a tablet device screen, and on like a desktop screen. And so the idea here was the whole purpose of Songmaker was to create a very minimal interface for music composition. So they really wanted that to be easy for everyone to use and to enjoy. And it was specifically for students. And they wanted to have a consideration of how could we make, this particular application work well for someone that may be only controlling the interface with a single switch. And so in the video, they're showing, I'd say the standard way of controlling this interface is clicking inside of the interface and clicking here to build up a rhythm. So we have a way with the mouse or with a touch finger to control the interface. And so the first thing to consider, or the first thing that we were considering for figuring out how to make this available to a single switch user was what would be an alternative way to input the notes and control this interface if we couldn't use the mouse and we could not use touch on the screen. So this is sort of one of the core concepts that I think was a really cool design on the site, is that very much at the top of the interface, there's this control, which is basically like a show or hide more game controls button. This as far as I know, isn't like a design pattern that's been standardized anywhere, but I liked the concept here that it's fairly hidden from the start. It's almost like a skip navigation link on a website. But when you expand the control, now we have the ability via a keyboard or via just a single input, we can tab to these controls and input notes. So now instead of having to use a mouse or keyboard to control the interface, and also not having to have, a rich set of controls of, inside of the grid itself is actually keyboard accessible here. So we could also implement notes in that range. But for someone using a switch or a single switch, we were demonstrating that it basically uses a scanning feature where we have to scan through, everything where a note could be input. And so if you were trying to compose a song and you needed to write out a melody line, having to scan through, every interactive line in this grid would be more difficult than being able to actually, find positions in the interface via these controls and then basically input those controls. So that was part of the design thinking is, well, if we have these as buttons, we would have a way for someone then with a single switch without any configuration to be able to toggle and launch those controls and then input them using just a single switch. So the other part of considering this was, I thought, and again, this is something that probably goes into the design of a lot of games, but also goes into a lot of design for web interfaces, is how to simplify the interface. So, we would want, or I would want someone that's trying out this experience from the beginning to have a good experience and to be able to get started and then build their skills or advance over time. So one of the things in the documentation for the teachers considering, how single switch users could interact with this control was some configuration settings. So this was, if we configure this interface to basically have a less number of bars and use like a pentatonic scale, which pentatonic scale would have notes that all sound good together, but require less notes and maybe just one octave. We can basically get a more simple interface that allows someone, again, to control and have fun composing music, but again, with less, a smaller grid and maybe a more focused area to get started and have an experience with. So I think of this, an analog to this on the web could be that, having a responsive design website where on the desktop width application, we might have lots of different controls and lots of navigation elements. But when we get down to the mobile device or the responsive view of the mobile device, it might be a simpler interface to navigate. And that's something that someone, again, that was using a single switch, the assumption is that the simpler the interface or the less elements to need to navigate through will make someone using a single switch more efficient. So the other part that this is, I want to just show this video, but this is what I think is a very, super genius feature inside of iOS that I have not seen in another technology implementation, but I share it as just something that, again, is to spark the conversation and spark the consideration for what can be done on, other software interfaces. This particular tool called Guided Access allows you to select elements that you don't want to receive focus or to be clickable. And so this is just a short video. I'll play it again. It was going pretty fast. Let's see if I can slow this. Inside of, when you turn on guided access inside of iOS, it lets you actually draw around certain parts of the user interface and say, I don't want keyboard focus or input focus to go to the elements that I'm drawing circles around or drawing squares around. So on the screen, I'm drawing around parts of this user interface that I don't want to receive focus. And now I have just at the end of that exercise, I have just the show hide controls button available in the UI, and I have the play button available in the UI. So thinking about how I could make this experience the best experience, to me right now, it seemed like the easiest one for educating educators. If they had iPads in the classroom, it's like, this is actually a way that we can say with this particular software interface used in conjunction with guided access, we can basically reduce all of the different tab stops that are on the screen and get it down to basically just the control that shows or hides other controls, and then the control that actually lets the user of SongMaker start and stop the music. And so that's I think ultimately, one of the things that, at least for really wanting someone who uses a single switch to be as efficient and successful as possible in the scenario of the technology we're designing, this seemed like an essential part to me, where basically in the default setup, if I had not turned on guided access, the switch control is going to be stopping at the tab inside of the Chrome UI, going into the back button, the refresh button, the address bar. It's going to go through other features in the UI that every single one of those tab stops is going to take time. If you remember at the beginning of the presentation, I was showing we could configure the auto scanning time to figure out how long the highlight for the scan should stay on a single element. And I had set it to 500 milliseconds, but we changed it to 1 second. If we think about 1 second without using this guided access tool, then it's going to be 1 second, waiting on this control, maybe 1 second waiting on this group of controls, 1 second waiting here. And again, at those seconds or that time adds up. And when we think about someone enjoying or having a successful experience, I think the amount of time it takes to, have an experience with it is a critical number, a critical thing to consider for, someone's enjoyment and or benefit of a piece of technology. So again, this is all documented and shown on the screen, but I think one of the things that's interesting about this exercise is it does allow you to have potentially a thought process about the experience you're designing. What are the most important features or functions? And so one of the things that's still sort of an open issue to me in this design is that the close button, once we have opened up this list of controls, again, I'm just going to simulate the auto scanning tool by hitting the tab key right now. But the order of the actions that we put into this particular control, ideally we put them in the order of the most frequently used action to the least frequently used action, because again, each time we're having the scanning go through the control, it's taking that time, it's having a period of needing to wait. And so if it's more common to enter a note, then we should move the note right to the beginning of this list of controls to make that a more efficient experience. And similarly, because once we open this grid and we're entering notes, it's probably more common that we're going to be entering a lot of notes and navigating through this machine it's not going to be as common that we're opening and closing the display. So this particular control itself could be moved to the end of that list, and that would then make potentially this a more efficient interface, take less time to complete. So what I wanted to show here is just I did do a breakdown of using 0.5 seconds. That's the same thing I started with here, 500 milliseconds for each switch. And with guided access turned on, it actually has 7 interactive stops on the page, and it will take the user 3.5 seconds basically to go once fully through the interface with the 7 controls that I've chosen displayed. So I'm going to let this video just play for, it's about 1:48, but this will let you see the experience of inputting a melody and a rhythm with this particular setup enabled. All right, so that there's about 1:45, and I think that was just a cool experience to see that with this design and with this combination of features, we can enable a student using a single switch to still be involved in the creative process. And as I showed here, this interface, as someone became more comfortable using it, we could expand the number of notes, expand what's available, expand what gets what settings get available, which settings are not available, but it shows kind of this ideation process of how you have these considerations. And so the next part that I think is interesting is, and again, this is just to spark discussion and thought processes, is that this idea of creating this control for this interface, you can on Apple, you can basically create, they have an accessibility keyboard active panel where we can choose basically for specific applications, only a certain set of buttons that we want shown. And I apologize, this is pretty small, but this is just the left up arrow, down arrow, right arrow buttons. And then it has the ability to make that be the keyboard. So if I added, like, say, I'm going to add a button and add the enter key, I could basically build a set of keys, or I could build this control for a specific interface and then have that be an interface that's available for that application or for that site. Now, there's still more things to do potentially for considering the web and having this be able to be a keyboard that appears on the web. But it's cool to actually see that this functionality is built in on at least the Mac OS, that if you needed to have more custom controls or a set of actions or a set of functions, you can design and develop this group of keys. And again, the idea of then only having 5 keys is we could use a single switch to just move through these 5 keys on the screen and just use those 5 keys when we're inside of that application. So that's one cool feature. Another cool feature, I don't get to show this application enough, but I like to show this demonstration of a desktop software. It doesn't have all accessibility, but it does have this remapping feature that I think could be very cool for a lot of software interfaces. This is also a music composition application called Ableton Live. And one of the ideas of Ableton Live is to make it so that any hardware interface can easily connect with it to control this software interface. And one thing that they've built into it is they also make it very easy to control it from the keyboard. So if I hit the keyboard shortcut Command key, all of the actions in the UI basically have a way for me to click on them and map a keyboard to them. So all of the interactive elements get this highlighting, and I can say, oh, the play button, I want that to be controlled by pressing the number 1. The stop button, I want that to be controlled by pressing the number 2. I want the sound itself to be muted by pressing the number 3. So I can choose any of these elements that are highlighted in yellow. I can click on them and then set a keyboard shortcut or modify the keyboard shortcut that currently controls it. And so when I do that, I can now use those keys on my keyboard to control the interface. And so again, if we think on top of that, if we had single switch sets of controls that became more common to be used for types of experiences on the web or types of desktop software, and we had this ability to remap the keys so that, for that particular application, whatever it may be, we can change or modify and say, like, well, this key should do this on that computer or that application. I think that's just a really cool feature. And so I just wanted to show that as a design that I think, could be more applied into other software interfaces, where when we have programmatic access for tools like screen readers, we are working to make sure all interactive elements have a programmatically accessible element. And then this sort of design feature shows a way that we can then overlay on top of that other functionality then to assign actions or assign keystrokes that are, specific to that user or configurable for that user. This is the document that I made heavy use of this document, Switch Access to Technology. comprehensive guide. So this is just a resource that I also wanted to advocate for. Someone, David Colvin and Simon Judge, did an excellent job. This is a very long document. It is a comprehensive guide. It starts on basically taking you through the different user interfaces for switching and letting you understand the different ways of controlling scans, highlighter movement controls, timing and input filtering, just lots and lots of details. So I really recommend, if you're interested in this area, taking a look at this document, Switch Access to Technology. And it really does, it pairs well if you have an iOS device to being able to basically read that document and get a good understanding of why most of the settings that do exist inside of the switch control setting on iOS, why they exist. Why they're there. Yeah, and then I guess I just wanted to, I see we have some questions. I wanted to make sure there was time here at the end to have a discussion, and happy to share.
Yeah, there's plenty of time.
Yeah.
There's plenty of time. So we'll get to PJ's first question.
Yeah.
Well, first, thank you for the presentation. That was very interesting. A lot of it reminded me of, I don't know if you're familiar with the guitar player Jason Becker.
No.
He was one of the big shredders of the mid 80s, and he unfortunately was diagnosed with ALS shortly after he got a gig with David Lee Roth. And while ALS is usually tantamount to a death sentence, he still composes music today with his father. And his story is amazing. There's a great documentary called Not Dead Yet, which I highly recommend. And a lot of this reminded me of him and just how he has pushed the use of software in order to compose and sing a switch. He can only use his eyes. He only has eye movement. And it reminded me of that. But our first question is from PJ. She asked, with guided access, how does someone leave the interface when most of the controls are hidden?
Yeah, so I think that's one of the, that's a great question. Thank you, PJ.
I thought about that as well.
Yeah, so that's, and actually I should definitely demo this, because if you go and, you get like, oh, this was a cool presentation, I'm going to try this out. This definitely had a similar sort of, there's a little bit of a pairing of those two features that is a concern, sort of like sometimes when people get freaked out the first time they turn on VoiceOver and they're like, how do I turn it off? It is sort of, for me, the thing with guided access, let me go to guided access tool. The core reason guided access was implemented was for, I think having the ability to have people also have that for, maybe their children also, and having people ways to control, I don't want these certain apps to be used. The passcode, this is sort of one of the parts I was struggling with, that's usually the way the guided access gets turned on and off. Although it does have the touch ID feature, which would allow if someone, does have the ability with the finger to use that, but guided access is set up that when you turn it on, let me have it. So right here, I'm on the music maker access. When I turn on guided access, this is basically, you get a UI telling you guided access started. When you try to turn that off, I'm using the triple click shortcut. So that's probably the normal way to turn it on and off, is to add it to your accessibility shortcuts menu. This accessibility shortcuts menu is accessible with the switch control as well, but it is very difficult that the combination of, if you have the switch control on and you go to guided access, you have to enter your passcode to get, to turn it off if you haven't set up the Touch ID. That's actually, I'm glad that you brought up this question, because this was something I did want to pose to Apple, but I was not getting switch access to that particular prompt to actually type in, and use the switch to type it in. So since I don't have the switch, I can type in my passcode, and that's actually how you turn on and off this functionality. So when I go into this feature, I could then say maybe I also don't want this button to be there, but I do want these buttons to be there. So this is sort of the options that you have there. You can have it be some other options for turning on and off the feature, but that's sort of the traditional way I do it is via the accessibility shortcut, and then I've been using the passcode to turn it on and off.
Okay, hope that answered your question, PJ. Our next one is from Sarah. Is the iOS switch mode using its own focus indication? Or more to the point, how important is visible display of focus on a web page app for single switch users?
So on iOS, at least, it is using its own focus. So on the switch control, you have you actually can select the cursor color from, there's 5 options: blue, red, green, yellow, and orange. And so it's not using or displaying the keyboard focus indicator. It's using its own. And I also had the large cursor turned on. That being said, though, that's something that, at least in my experience, this was one of the other challenges I had. You know, I was super motivated to work on this project. It's like, oh, this is exciting. I want to figure out how to do this and have it work well for Android out of the box, iOS out of the box, Mac OS out of the box, and Windows OS. That's what I try to do, right, for screen reader and some of the other features. But it was difficult that they're so different between the platforms of what's sort of built in for free. I'm just answering Sarah's question for iOS. I'm not confident that that would be the same answer on one of the other platforms, but on iOS, it draws its own rectangle.
Okay. And one final one. Have you seen Chris Hill's book about switch control on iOS?
Is Chris, I have to ask if Chris Hill was the one switch guy. I did also link, did Chris Hill write?
I'm not sure. He said it's in the iTunes section.
Okay, yeah, I did link, yes. So that's, I haven't seen the book, but that I do have that also mentioned in his, in the write-up I did of this, that he does have a switch control overview too that goes into a really good depth of on YouTube of the different features and the different modes. And so it sounds like too we're being made aware that there's a book too. So I didn't know that. I'll definitely check that out. So thank you for letting me know.
And one more. Can individual user preferences be recorded to later be evaluated for possible best practices with an application? Or if that's not possible, are preferences too individualized to use that data to enhance other users' experience?
Yeah, I think that comment of like, can we record and sort of understand those features? I mean, I think that's the right type of design thinking. I mean, that's one of the things that interested me of like, I'm showing this music interface, right? And it was sort of fortunate that by design, that was the goal was to keep it a simple interface. But I do think there's something to be said for like having an analytical understanding of like most used features and functions for any type of experience. If that, as far as I know, I'm sure there is, ways to use things like Google Analytics or other third-party software to gather that data. I don't know of a platform way built in to gather it, but I think that's definitely additional work that should continue and or be part of a process where if we really want to have in the future just interfaces be automatically better for single switch users, we have to have that type of consideration. And I think it's almost like the software should be able to configure itself into an ordering of elements, that are most used based off of tasks. Because as I said, when you have to think about the amount of time it takes to scan through each item, I do really like looking at that as a math problem, because it is a mathematical, the time is realistic of how long it has to spend on each one. And so I think that's definitely stuff that should be happening and, may already be happening and I'm just not aware of it. So.
Okay. For other people that were listening about the Chris Hill's book, someone posted a link in the chat. It's called Handsfree, Mastering Switch Control on iOS by Christopher Hills and Perez. Luis Perez. Well, I'll go ahead and toss a link out with that in the
Cool. All right.
YouTube video. So, unless there's any more questions, we'd like to thank Thomas for his time, and that was incredibly interesting. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
And our next technically will be on January 2nd with Jared, what's his name? Jared Smith of WebAIM. He'll be discussing the interplay between page content, including ARIA, browser parsing, rendering, accessibility APIs, and assistive technology, which is something that is incredibly important for developers to have a sense of whenever they're implementing and testing accessibility. And again, that's on January 2nd, 2019. It'll be our first one of the new year. So thanks again so much to Thomas for his time and presentation, and thank you very much for joining us today.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank